about in the 21st century for a truly just, equitable, public vision of how we should engage with the world. So it's with that we've invited Professor Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University. A few words of introduction, really a few relative to his accomplishments. Many of you know about Professor Stiglitz. He is the awardee of 1.01 Nobel Prizes, really 0.01, because he also contributed, apart from the Nobel Prize in Economics, he contributed the IPCC Climate Change Report, which won the Nobel Prize many years ago now. He's also extremely well known in economics. Anyone who's an economics student here, I know a few of you are, you'd have come across the name many, many, many times. In fact, just today, my colleague Anand Srivastava and I were going over our new course on mathematical models in economics, and we had several chapters that we had to go through, and then, not today, but a week ago, and I asked him, does Stiglitz have to be in every one of these? And he said yes, right? So he's truly an extraordinarily gifted and prolific economist. He has over 40, 50 doctorates. But really, you know, that's not the reason why I like listening to Joe Stiglitz. The reason I like listening to Joe Stiglitz is that he really embodies what it means to be a good public intellectual. 20 years ago, when it was not fashionable, he took on the question of globalization and said that there was the forces of globalization weren't all benign, that in fact you might see the forces of reaction. He was 20 years ahead of his time at that point of time. And ever since then, he's really been a very clear moral voice for us as people who are interested in understanding how to change the world and how to be in a more just and sustainable world. You know, sometimes economists get a bad rap, but sometimes I like to think about why I became an economist and why this kind of thinking is so important. And I'd like to kind of harken back to this really wonderful moment in economics history. About 70 years ago, John Maynard Keynes, when he was stepping down as the editor of the Economic Journal, apparently toasted the economists in the room. And he said, to the economists, the trustees of the possibility of civilization. And so I'd like to welcome maybe one of the greatest trustees of civilization right now, Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here in Bangalore. And to participate in this series about the public. And it's really the subject of my talk this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about the need for the public in the context of economic policy, that the nature of the world today is very different from the nature of the world 250, 300 years ago, when people were mostly in agriculture, you were farmers. The nature of the interactions in a primitive agrarian economy is very different from that in a modern innovation economy. And that calls for a different kind of economy and a different kind of politics. And I'm going to try to describe what I think is the nature of that politics, the nature of the organization of society. The particular word I'm going to call it is progressivism, progressive capitalism. It's reflecting a book that I recently came out called People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. But if I were writing this more for a European audience, I would have called it a rejuvenated social democracy. I'll explain why the use of those particular words. So let me begin with the idea of progressivism. It's a belief that progress is possible, and it's within our power to construct an economic and social system that advances progress. And of course, as an economist, I'm going to talk a great deal about sustainable increases in standards of living, reflected, for instance, in increases in life expectancy. But I'm also going to be talking about broader notions of progress, notions of tolerance, human rights, a more humane society with less prejudice, less discrimination, and less exploitation. And just to give you a feeling of, from a historical point of view, the notion of progress we often take for granted, but it is actually a relatively new notion. And the reason that it is a new notion is that for hundreds of years, there wasn't any progress. So if we had been born 500 years ago, no matter where in the world, there'd be no reason to have much confidence about the notion of progress. So this is a particular chart, which, these data are hard to put together, and this particular chart is from the Institute for New Economic Thinking, but it looks at the historical living standards in a whole range of countries. And what you see is that for hundreds of years, there was almost no change until the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And then you see a sharp increase, first in Western Europe and North America, and then in Asia with the Asia miracle spreading around the world. As many of you may know, the British loved gathering data and keeping records, and that's one of the sources that we have for finding out. And so in London, you can get data on the wages and what everything costs, going back hundreds of years. And this is a chart of the real wages of London craftsmen over the last 800 years. And it's the same kind of pattern that the previous chart showed, basically, that no significant increase. Every once in a while, there'll be a little blip up. If you have a bubonic plague and a third of the population gets wiped out, laws of supply and demand, there's a labor shortage and wages go up a little bit. But then they come down again, and that's the sort of Malthusian idea. But essentially no change, again, until quite late. And then life expectancy shows the same kind of pattern. We are really lucky to be born at the current time in terms of our life expectancy. It has really increased enormously. If you look at the vertical axis there, in 1820, in much of the world, life expectancy was on average around 30 years. In other places, it was 40 years, but that's still not great. And now, in the best of countries, it's close to 80 years. So that raises the natural question, what made all of this possible? And there were basically three things that really made it possible. The first and the most important is science, advances in our understanding of the world around us. And we shouldn't forget that. It really is the basis of why we live better than people if we'd been born 250 years ago. But also social sciences, advances in our understanding of humankind. And related to that, advances in social organization, the ability to organize cooperative activities, you might call it the public, to coordinate on a large scale. And that includes economic activities organized through markets, governed by the rule of law. It means, and this is importantly related to the theme of this lecture series, collective action, people working together, which is so necessary for a modern economy and society. The basis of science is, underlying all science is basic research. And basic research has always been publicly provided. If you think about the things I talked about extension of life expectancy. What are the big things there? Discovery of DNA. And that was publicly funded. And so, and I could go through all the things that have really transformed our well-being. It's through basic research and public funding. And finally, politics. Politics sets the rules of the game. And here, I believe, democracies are critical, both as a value in its own right, but also as setting the rules of the game for the economy. And making democracies work, making our politics work, includes important ideas like separation of powers, checks and balances, and a whole set of ideas that have developed over the last 200 years. I sometimes joke that somehow our president missed all those classes at school when we talked about these ideas. And I don't know where he was. Maybe that's why they won't release his grades, because maybe he was there and just didn't learn. But anyway, these are really important ideas. And these are all the central ideas of the Enlightenment. And these are the ideas that set the stage for progress. So let me, in the next couple of minutes, try to lay out the basic ideas that I want to develop here, and I won't have time to develop them fully, but there you'll have to get the book. But the basic idea is, first, the source of wealth of nations. This was the title of the Adam Smith's book, which actually began economics. The source of the wealth of nations is the basis of the science, the things I've just described, and that there's widespread confusion between what makes for the wealth of a nation and for wealthy individuals. The U.S. and other advanced countries have become, to too large an extent, a country of rent seekers, of people who become wealthy not by adding to the wealth of the nation, but by trying to get a larger share of the wealth of the nation. There are a lot of people who've added to the wealth of nations, and those are to be celebrated. But unfortunately, there are also people like Donald Trump who try to take advantage of other people. And I'll describe a little later all the mechanisms that have been developed by which some individuals have learned how to exploit others. So those two different ideas, what creates the wealth of nations and what creates wealthy individuals, are two potentially distinct ideas. The third idea I want to put forward is that neoliberalism, the idea that of unfettered markets, or at least too much focus on markets, with too little focus on the public, on the collective action, has not worked well. It has provided too large of a scope for rank seeking, leading to high levels of inequality, and this kind of view of the world, which ignores the importance of externalities of the public, is particularly inadequate for dealing with the critical problems that we have today, including climate change. And that's why so many young people who have become aware of these failures are coming to support the views that I'm describing today. There is justified discontent with the economic system in the United States and in Western Europe and many other countries. One way of thinking about it is that we think we've had enormous advances in knowledge. We think we've had enormous reform after reform, so our markets are supposed to be working better. But what happened to economic growth? It's actually gone down. What's happened to the well-being of most citizens? It's stagnated. It's not gone up. The limited growth that has occurred has gone to a very few at the top. And these problems, while the United States embodies them most clearly. And I'm going to use a lot of data from the United States because it's a textbook model of what not to do. And you know, in medicine, you always look at sick people to understand what we call a pathology, to understand what is going wrong. There's a lot of good things in America, but if you want to understand what not to do, you also need to study the United States, and I'll try to give you some examples. So this shows you what's happened to the growth in the United States before the neoliberal reform that started around the late 1970s and after. In the quarter century after World War II, the growth in the United States was 4.4%, and in Europe was close to 5%, and you can see there the marked decrease. That's bad enough, but if you look at what's happened to the well-being of different groups in our society, it's much more dramatic. So that line that looks like it's the horizontal axis is not the horizontal axis. It's the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans. And if you look at it with a microscope, you can see that there's some increase in income over the last, this is 45 years. But you don't need a microscope to see what's happened to the average income of the top 1%. The dotted line, which is going up, is where all the income in the United States has gone over the last 45 years. And I should say, you know, one of the things that we teach our students is how to lie with statistics. This is not manipulating the data at all. You know, this is not using log numbers or anything like that. These are called natural numbers. So this is just the data as it comes out of the statistical basis, and you see what's happened. And the picture for Europe is a little bit better, but not much better. It's the same qualitative pattern, but just not the same extreme. So that leads me to, in a sense, the main theme of this talk. It's not just to say things are not going well, but I wanted to put forward an agenda for how to fix it. In particular, you can say, I little involved in politics, and I wanted to put an agenda that some of the more progressive candidates for office in the United States could adopt as part of their agenda for what to do about the problems that I'm going to describe a little bit more vividly. So progressive capitalism is an alternative economic model. It's not an oxymoron. It's, in a way, a modern adaptation of ideas underlying European social democracy. It entails a new social contract between the market, the state, and civil society. I use the word capitalism, to remind us that the market plays a central role. The market is going to be a very important part of the story. And it's very interesting when I've given versions of this talk in France. Among the students, you feel the antipathy towards capitalism. And I have to explain the market, you know, has some problems, but we can fix it. But it is interesting the default position among a lot of young people because of the failures is a very hostile one. So I call it capitalism to remind us that the market plays a central role, but I use the word progressive to remind us that it's not unfettered capitalism, that capitalism is not an end in itself, but a means to broader societal objectives of increasing the well-being of all of our citizens. Part of this new social contract entails recognizing that a successful society must be based on a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. And by that, what I want to emphasize, sometimes in our discussions we talk about the private sector, the market, and on the other hand, we talk about the government. But between the two, there are many, many other kinds of institutional forms. I like to think among the most successful American institutions are our universities. And 90% of our most successful universities, the ones that you know most, are Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, are all not-for-profit foundations, like Premji. They're not for-profit, they're not state institutions, but they work very well, and they have had 300 years of very successful role in actually putting. They are at the core of America's entire economic success. We think of America as an advanced society. It's the universities, and they're not for profit. When you think of profit universities, what comes to people's mind is Trump University. And Trump University succeeds in doing only one thing: figuring out how to exploit people's ambitions, aspirations, taking money away from them, and giving them nothing in return. I don't know if you know that at the time he became president, he had to settle with millions and millions of dollars, dozens of suits, because he had taken advantage of people. So that's private universities, private for-profit universities, as opposed to places that are the non-for-profits, foundations that are promoting the well-being of our society. But there are lots of other forms of institutions, and I think we ought to be doing more exploration of other forms of institutions. For instance, co-ops. People think, again, America being either profit or state. The only part of our financial sector that worked well in the years before 2008 and after 2008 were our co-op banks. The co-op banks in the United States are called credit unions, and they were the only ones that did not engage in excessive risk-taking and predatory behavior. And after the crisis, they're the only ones that continued lending to small businesses that supported the recovery of our economy. So, and there are many other co-ops within the United States. The publisher of my book is a producer co-op, Norton. And I think it's a great publisher, and they are devoted to publishing, I think, good books. The final point, which I'm not going to have time to go to, but I do want to emphasize, is that economic relations shape who we are. That one of the problems in standard economics is that you begin with the underlying notion of the nature of the human being is that they come into the world with well-defined preferences and are unaffected by anything else. But we know that's not true. As parents, we work very hard to shape our children. As educators, we work very hard to shape our students. We hope we are not just putting ideas, teaching, filling their minds with theorems. We also hope that we are shaping them in a broader sense. Well, economic relations shape who we are and have broad implications for the nature of our society. There is evidence that if people are part of cooperatives, they become more cooperative. If you are part of institutions, I don't know if there are many people here who are bankers, but there's been a lot of behavioral research in behavioral economics, which show, I won't have time to, which show that bankers are more dishonest than other people. And if you remind bankers that they're bankers, they're more dishonest than if you remind them that they're human beings as well. So these are all aspects of what we call the endogeneity of who we are, that we are shaped by our society. So let me begin by going back to the major themes that I wanted to touch on this evening. And the first was just to remind us, because it is at the core of everything in economics, is what is the source of the wealth of nations? And it is the creativity of its people, investments in its people, infrastructure, and in capital goods, especially in science and technology, and the institutions which enable them to cooperate together to do more than anyone could do alone. One aspect that I wanted to call attention to, which has been under attack and gotten short shrift, is that all of these things, science, our social institutions, all require systems of discovering, assessing the truth. And the most disturbing aspect of our political moment, that's a diplomatic way of describing where we are in the United States and some other country. The most disturbing aspect of our political moment is the attack on our basic epistemological system, with far-reaching effects on our civilization, our standards of living, and the functioning of our systems of political and social organization. So the particular policies, say, of Trump, those will go when he goes. But he will have done enormous damage to our institutions, and that will take a long time for us to recover from. And that's why I try to keep a focus on the importance of these notions of the underlying basis of the wealth of nations, the importance of science, of our social institutions, of notions of truth-telling and truth assessing. It's the media, our education institutions, our research institutions, our judiciary. All of these have come under systematic attack, and not just in the United States. And the damage from this is going to be enormous. And for those of us who are committed, both in terms of values, but even in terms of our standard of living, and that's why this is an issue, you might say, of fundamental values, but it's also the source of the wealth of nations. So if you want to think about where you're going to be in 20 years or 40 years, this is something that one really has to think about very deeply. I also want to just reiterate, this perspective is somewhat different from that of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was writing in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence of the United States. That was a long time ago. And Adam Smith was writing when the economy was a primitive agricultural economy with a small commercial sector. The manufacturing sector was a pin factory. And that's very different from a modern innovation economy, a modern service sector economy, even very different from the industrial economy of the 20th century. So we shouldn't look just to the Adam Smith and those ideas of 200 years ago. He had a lot of insights, but we really have to think about the nature of our civilization today, and that's why the public is so important. The nature of a civilization today is it's based on innovation, and that's based on basic research, which is going to be publicly provided. And the nature of our civilization today is that we are now confronting planetary boundaries, limits of the environment, which we didn't face 250 years ago. He never talked about those issues, but we have to today. Nor did he really think about globalization and the interdependence of the nations of the world, because, again, he didn't have to. So that was the first important idea that I wanted to emphasize. The second is this idea that there is a major confusion between what makes a country rich and what makes an individual rich. Individuals, as I said before, can become rich by taking advantage of others, by what economists call rent-seeking or wealth-grabbing. There are many bases of this kind of exploitation. There's exploiting market power, asymmetries of information, an area that I contributed a lot of my research on. But it's also exploiting human foibles and vulnerabilities, taking advantage of people's aspirations to get ahead or people's tendency to gamble, and exploiting political power. If you look at the source of the wealthy in the United States, there are many people who've actually contributed to our society. But there are also many people who got wealthy by taking advantage of others. So, and even when there is some social contribution, wealth is often amplified by the exercise of market power. So if you look at, and I'll emphasize this a little, the key many of the wealthy people in the United States, what you discovered, they made a contribution, but one of their insights was how to create, amplify, and their market power, and extend their market power. The basic economics that we teach to all our students is that competition should drive down profits. And in some cases, that happens. But in many sectors of the economy, competition hasn't been working. And one of the real issues is why. And I'll give some examples in a few minutes, but the core idea is that we in the United States, and people elsewhere too, have been extremely innovative in figuring out how to create market power, how to make sure that there is not competition. You know, I jokingly say it's one of the main things we do at Columbia Business School. You know, it's no fun if you spend $200,000 to get an MBA. You don't want to spend that money to get a competitive wage. You want monopoly returns. And we teach you how to do that. There are a whole set of gimmicks. And then I say that there's a synergy here between the economics department and the business school. Because the economics department works to figure out how to stop the business school students from doing what we taught them in the business school to do. So we try to figure out how to make sure our economy is competitive. So we work together to keep each other fully employed. One of the things, so just to mention one name, but Microsoft has been found guilty on 3 different continents of violating antitrust laws. So he may have made an important contribution in devising the PC's operating system, but then he took that and leveraged that with market power that generated enormous wealth. It's interesting, he's given away most of that wealth, so he should be commended for that. But at the same time, he generated that in ways that violated the laws in Asia, Europe, and America. If you look at the list of the wealthiest people in the world, that list typically does not include those who have made among the most important societal contribution, the discovery of DNA, the transistor, the laser. And if you look at the wealthy, it includes a disproportionate number of people in the financial sector. The share of the financial sector in the United States went from 2.5% of GDP to near 8%. And what was the result? Growth slowed, and we got more instability. So one of the challenges of research today is to understand better the bases of exploitation, how it can be sustained, There are many forms taking advantage, as I mentioned before, of asymmetries of information, individual vulnerabilities, exploiting the public, which is the old-fashioned way of rent seeking, getting a government procurement at below market prices, at above market prices as a way to get wealthy, or getting government assets, public assets like oil wells, at below market prices is another way of getting wealthy. And I think all of you know about examples in almost all countries in which both of these forms occur. But one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later are the role of unfair rules of the game. So when we look at the United States, there's been a particular concern about the growth in market power, and that has become one of the major political themes of the day. Another book by Thomas Fleelpong just came out in the last week documenting the increase in market power in the United States. Sometimes it's very open. You all know that in many areas, particularly in the new technology, there'll be one or two firms that dominate the market. But sometimes it's in very obscure areas. There's a website that lists how many firms make up 75 or 80% of the market. And you'd be surprised, it includes dog food, for instance. But also, there are many cases where you wouldn't know that there was one firm. If you come to New York City, you'll see many different drugstores. There's Walgreens and there's Duane Reade. But most people don't know that Walgreens and Duane Reade are the same company. They just have different names to confuse you, to think that there's competition. But there's no competition. It's one company. There are many reasons for this that economists have delved into: changing market structure, changing technology, the innovations in creating market power, the failure of regulations to keep up with the innovativeness of the private sector in creating market barriers. But also, we have a Supreme Court who doesn't believe in competition. So there was a recent case just a few months ago where anti-competitive practices and payments mechanisms were challenged in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was unfazed, said, fine. You know, it cost a fraction of a penny to send an electron to tell when you buy something, you want money to go from your bank account to the merchant bank account. How much should that cost? Almost nothing. How much do they charge? 1%, 2%, 3% or more of what is purchased. So if you spend $1,000, that they may get $30 for what cost a fraction of a penny. And they can do it because of these anti-competitive contracts that they force the merchant to sign, which include a provision that the merchant can't even tell you how much he has to pay, let alone charge you. These are contracts that keep things secret. Well, well-functioning markets have to be based on a certain degree of transparency, and this is obviously subverting that. So the result of that is that the financial sector literally gets tens of billions of dollars. A grocery store in the United States that accepts a credit card divides its profits 50-50 between itself for doing all the management of the grocery store, hiring people, buying produce, all that risk, and the bank. And you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. The bank is just, the cost of that fraction of a penny. Why are they making so much money? Market power. And that's just one of the obvious examples of the problems that we're facing today? Well, the result of this is that the competitive paradigm, which is at the basis of the teaching of economics in most places around the world, provides a poor basis for understanding 21st century market economy. One of the consequences of the concentration of market power is inequality, because the owners of these market powers are relatively few. And so you get large agglomerations of wealth. It's not the only source of wealth. As I say, there's a whole, many other explanations, so I don't want to emphasize it too much. But it helps understand what is going on. I want to spend just a minute to highlight the nature of the inequality in the United States, because I think people may not fully appreciate what has happened over the last 40 years in the United States. Because a lot of people look at the success of the United States and don't understand some of these problems. And these problems are now being manifested, I think, in our politics. So the inequality shows up not just in that stagnant part at the bottom. There's stagnation of incomes in the middle, but actually decreases in the bottom. The share of labor appropriately measured is decreasing. The wealth is much more concentrated than income. There are inequalities in access to health. Life expectancy in the United States has been on decline since Trump became the president, and significantly so. There are inequalities of opportunity and inequalities of voice, power, and access to justice. So I'm going to go through just a few charts very quickly to give you a picture of what is going on. The first describes median income, half above, half below, of a full-time male worker, and the full-time guys are the lucky ones. A lot of people in the Midwest, the South, can't get a full-time job. Their income, adjusted for inflation, is the same as it was some 42 years ago. So if you look at some of the Trump rallies, they are disproportionately male, and they are obviously expressing a kind of discontent. I don't want to say economics is the only source of the problem, but it certainly helps make it more understandable. And so what you see is that their income is below the level that it was in 1972. That's a long time not to get a pay raise, especially when you look at that chart I gave in the very beginning of what's happening to the 1%, and when they turn on TV, they get an impression that everybody's doing very well. And especially in America, where nobody wants to talk about things not going well. So publicly, everybody is happy. Privately, they're not, because they're committing suicide. But publicly, the stance is everything is fine. The real wages at the bottom are even worse. The real wages at the bottom in the United States are the same as they were 60 years ago. And when I give this talk, kind of talk in developing countries, say in China, where 60 years ago, per capita income was $150. It's inconceivable. 60 years of no progress, 60 years of no pay raise. And it's not as if it was that great then. I sometimes go on, a lot of the young people get their news from comedy news shows in the evening. And the point is that the news is so terrible, the only way you can take it is with some degree of comedy. So I sympathize with young people. So I was on one of these shows, and the Bill Maher show, and he said, well, at the wages that people get at the bottom in New York, how many hours do you have to work a week to pay your rent? And the answer comes out like 400 hours a week. And the point he was trying to make is there is no way that you can survive on $7.25 an hour in New York City, which is the wage we get. And our taxi cab drivers using Uber get paid. The Taxi Cab Commission did a study of what the actual wage paid per hour of taxi cab drivers, of all the people working, $6 an hour. They don't even pay the minimum wage. This is a graph that shows the decline in the share of labor. When I was a graduate student, one of the things that we were taught is the distribution of income never changes. And we developed complicated theories to explain why that was so. And we just finished doing that when we got new data say it's been changing dramatically. So now the great thing is the students now have a new thing to explain. Why is it changing so dramatically? And what you see there is the decline of the share of labor. And this is an important warning for any student. Labor includes CEOs and bankers. So what we had to do is to take out from the data the CEOs and the bankers, and that brings it down from 80 to 75, but that share has gone from 75 down to 60% in a relatively short time. Wealth is more unequally distributed than income. For instance, the top 1% of those in the United States get around 22, 25% of income, but they get have twice the share of wealth. But this is a little graph that I hopefully to illustrate the inequality in the United States in wealth. The Walton family and the Koch brothers, 8 people who didn't get wealthy by working, but by inheriting, have as much wealth as the bottom, have as much wealth as the bottom 35% of America. That's enormous. I mean, it should be obvious, enormous inequality. To put it another way, about half of all Americans have somewhere around $500 in their bank account, or less. So if their car breaks down, they can't get to work because we don't have good public transportation. So they live in that kind of edge of fragility. The wealth inequality is such that the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans has now almost 25% of all the wealth. One of the things that this graph illustrates is another point, that inequality has not always been as high. It was that high before the Great Depression. And then we had a number of reforms and a lot of changes, and we had much more egalitarian society. There were dramatic changes. You see that coming down. And then, beginning with the Reagan-Thatcher era, it's soaring up very rapidly. One of the things that is a particular concern is inequalities of opportunity. The idea, many of you may think of America being a land of opportunity, and it is a land of opportunity if you begin life with $1 billion. The Koch brothers and Walton, they had a land of opportunity. But also it's a land of opportunity if you come to America with a lot of brains. It does have an opportunity for a lot of people to get ahead if you are talented enough. But what economists or social scientists mean by opportunity is not those exceptions, not those exceptional people, but what happens on average. That is to say, what are the life prospects of somebody born at the bottom versus somebody born at the top? And the answer is, the life prospects of young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country. So I tell my students, there is one important decision you have to make in life. And if you don't get that right, the game is over. And that decision is choosing the right parent. Yeah, it's not actually that funny. It's actually sad, but the only way we can deal with this kind of reality is with humor. The graph shows this with little flags, where on the vertical axis you have a standard measure of income inequality. It doesn't grasp fully the poverty traps and the wealth traps. And then there is a standard measure of income inequality. The horizontal axis is earnings mobility. It's a measure of opportunity. And what you see is those countries like the United States and the UK that have the highest level of inequality also have the lowest level of opportunity. And the Scandinavian countries, as one might have thought, have the highest level of equality and the highest level of opportunity. And that's not an accident. There's a systematic relationship between the two. One way that shows up is in studies that look at what happens to a kid at the bottom who does very well at school versus a kid born at the top who does very badly at school. The kid at the top who does badly will wind up with a higher income than the kid at the bottom who does well at school, on average. So that really undermines our sense of identity, because as a country, we like to think of ourselves as a land of opportunity. I mean, it really is fundamental, but the numbers, the facts, don't seem to support that. One of the most troubling aspects of inequality today in the United States is, as I said before, health, the decline in life expectancy in health. And what's especially surprising is data on white males, because people always said, oh, America has this very mixed, you have people of different racial, ethnic groups, and of course things are complicated. But when you break out what has happened to white Americans from other groups, what you see is actually Hispanics and African Americans have been improving. That the graph in the upper corner is the death rate, the morbidity rate. So it's the opposite. Going down is good. You want the death rate to go down. Is that clear? Rather than the life expectancy. So you understand. And what you see is the death rate of white Americans is going up, and every other group around the world is going down. And most disturbing is the causes of that death. These are what Ann Case and Angus Deaton got the 2015 Nobel Prize in economics, to describe as deaths of despair. And they documented to do with lack of hope. These are people who, so it's not as if there is a epidemic going around the country. It is an epidemic, but it's a social disease. It is alcoholism, opioid, drug overdose, and suicide. And you see at the bottom curve the increasing incidence of both of those. What is striking is how fast this disease, this social disease, has spread across the country. So this is what's called a heat map, where the darker areas represent the places in the country where the death rates are highest. Okay? And there's a difference. There are some parts of the country that are healthier than other parts. The left-hand side is 2000, the other side is 2014, and you can see the darkening of what's happened. It's dramatic. And the same figure would go if I focused just on the deaths of despair. That's what's driving it. And what you will notice, and you can do a correlation, you will notice that those areas that supported Trump are those areas that are dark. And those are areas where there's lack of opportunity. If you look at where, if I had done a graph showing opportunity, i.e. mobility, they show up exactly in the same color. So there is a correlation between these deaths, this opportunity, inequality, and politics. Unfortunately, problems may get even worse because the changes in technology may both augment market power and decrease the demand for workers, especially those of limited skills. It doesn't have to cause more inequality. The economic pie is larger, and so everybody could be better off. But in our distorted politics, the question is, will that actually happen? And the second reason, of course, that things may get worse is the growth that we've experienced is not sustainable. We are living beyond our planetary boundaries. And even the growth that we have is based on basic research that was done years ago. We have not been investing as much in basic research. The percentage of our GDP in basic research is gone down. Trump proposed cutting basic research by 1/3. And fortunately, he didn't get his way. But the fact is, if that is the trend towards which America is going, things may be getting worse. And there are other other sources of concern. Their overall investment has not been doing well, even though profits are very high. And just to show that the profits have been very high, but investment has been going down. And one of the striking things I described before, the fact that the share of labor is going down. Actually, if you look at the share of capital, hard to get this data, but this is the basis of the best data we have. The share of capital is actually going down. Well, you have to ask the question: if the share of labor is going down and the share of capital is going down, economists disagree about everything except what's true. The share of all the shares have to add up all together to 1. So if labor is going down and capital is going down, what's gone up? It's the share of rents. And that's the issue of monopoly power and exploitation power and those other issues that I talked about before. So the point, this brings me back to the theme that second theme that I emphasized, and that is the importance of this distinction between the wealth of nations and what makes for some people being wealthy, and that is exploitation. And I'm focusing now on just one aspect of that, the exploitation of market power. And that helps explain many aspects of the U.S. economy. It's consistent with a low investment rate. That low investment rate helps explain the low growth rate that I described before. The increases in market power help explain the increase in inequality. We are now beginning to have a new view of the consequences of inequality. And this is a big deal. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, discussions of inequality and the consequences began with what was called the big trade-off. President Johnson's economic advisor, Arthur Oken, wrote a book called The Big Trade-Off. And the idea was, if you want to have more equality, you can get it, but at the price of economic growth. So you could have one or the other, but you couldn't have both. That was a very strongly held doctrine. And now the economics profession is coming to a consensus that given the extremes of inequality, given the way inequality is generated, we can have more growth with more equality. And as I say, this is a big change in perspective. Interestingly, it's a change in perspective that is receiving support not just from, you call progressive economists like me, but even from the IMF. And for those of you who don't know, the IMF is not a left-wing institution, but they have been propounding, arguing, and I've seen them, the head of the IMF, talk about this all over the world, telling countries, you have too much inequality, and that inequality is hurting your economic performance. There are many reasons for why inequality may be bad for economic performance, and I can't go into it now, but some of them should be obvious. One of them is countries, economies with a lot of inequality. Remember, we show that high inequality is associated with high inequality of opportunity. And that means people who are born of parents who are not well off don't get the education that they need to live up to their potential. So countries with high levels of inequality are wasting their most valuable resource, their human resources. It's also the case that there are other explanations that countries with high levels of inequality have difficulties of getting the politics to support good public schools, good public infrastructure, basic research. Some of what we've done, collective action, the public space, that you need for a well-functioning society can't work. But it's also because inequality today is to a large extent associated with rent-seeking. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And rent-seeking is a distortion in the economy. Market power is a distortion in the economy. An economy without competition is not going to be as dynamic as economy. And one of the things I didn't mention, but if you look at the data for the United States, the fraction of new firms in the United States is down. We are becoming even a less innovative economy. And it's interesting, everybody thinks of America being an innovation economy, but the rate of growth of GDP productivity is actually down overall. Yes, we're very good in innovation in social media, but that's only one part of an economy. You can't live on social media. You need other things. I mean, it's important, maybe, but and finally, inequality undermines democracy. As I already mentioned, societies with high inequality want a weak state because those at the top don't need the public goods, and they worry about the danger of the state using its powers for redistribution. There's a vicious circle economic inequality leads to political inequality, and that leads to rules of the game that reinforce economic inequality. And reinforce the political inequality. And we're seeing that especially true in the United States because we already have rules that have meant that we've gone, that give money a lot of power in politics. It's true in all countries, but so we've canonized it to the point where I say that our democracy is better described as $1 one vote than one person one vote. The manifestations of this go to things you will read about in the paper: voter suppression, gerrymandering, a whole set of, just to give you a couple things, I worry about telling you about this in case any of you are on the wrong side and will use these ideas here in India. But a couple of things. One of the stakes in the U.S., you vote on Tuesday. It's a work day. And that makes it harder for workers to vote. The more liberal states have said, we're going to allow you to vote by mail. So you don't have to give up a day's work in order to vote. But the more right-wing states who don't want workers to vote, what they've done is shorten the voting poll time. So they only are open during working hours. So if you want to vote, you have to give up a day's wages. So that's an example of the kind of voter suppression that is going on. But there are lots of other things that are going on. You can contrast that with Australia, for instance, that says they passed a law that everybody has to vote. Or more accurately, everybody has to go to the voting booth. You don't have to cast your vote, but if you don't go to the voting booth, you get fined. So they're trying to incentivize citizen participation. This is a big deal because in the United States, voting turnout is very low. And so when somebody gets elected, it doesn't represent a view of a majority of the citizens. So what I've described here, I hope, is not too depressing, but it is a view of some of the maladies facing the United States. And unfortunately, countries that have tried to imitate the United States have gotten very similar outcomes. Not as bad because they haven't done as good a job imitating us. But I can assure you that if you do imitate us successfully, you too can get these outcomes. So half my book is really about what do we do about it? And I'm only going to have time to summarize it fairly quickly. The idea is that progressive capitalism, that I described very briefly in the beginning, as a major reform. The term progressive harks back to a time in the United States, the late 19th century. This was a time when you had the Standard Oil, you had a lot, it was called the Gilded Age. There was a lot of inequality, a lot of market power, and there was a public outcry, a civil society movement that succeeded. It was called the Progressive Movement that got progressive legislation. It was bipartisan. It included Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, and it succeeded in passing competition laws and social legislation. There were no labor laws before that, no protection of workers, no safety regulations. I mean, people were burning at work, fires. I mean, it was really terrible. And New York led the way. There were no minimum wages. And we passed a whole set of legislation that worked. And that succeeded eventually in making the economy more competitive, increasing growth, and reducing inequality. And so, in a way, the use, for my using the word progressive capitalism, is harking back to that metaphor, to that historical reference. There are four major elements of this. The first is rewriting the rules of the economy. To constrain power and its abuses, to create a more efficient and fair economy, to ensure that we live within our planetary boundary. In fact, the present rules constrain the opportunities for working together. They constrain the opportunities for workers to get together for collective action. They constrain the ability of those who are injured by firms to get together for class action suits. So actually, the present rule book is designed to inhibit people working together. And so when I talk about collective action, I don't mean just through government. It's important. NGOs play a very important role in our society. And there are attempts in one way or another to constrain other forms of collective action outside the state. And to me, these other forms are very important. And the current rules favor a very narrow view of capitalism, and I'll explain that a little bit later. The other three elements are public expenditure, fair and efficient taxation, and ensuring access to a basic, decent life. So let me spend most of my time on rewriting the rules of the market economy. And here I want to begin by just emphasize that markets don't exist in a vacuum. Quite often in economics courses, you talk about demand and supply, or you talk about markets, and it's as if they just exist. But those of you who work in the business community know that you have to operate within a whole set of rules and regulations. And they have a lot to do with how you prosper. There are competition laws I've talked about in the financial sector. There are rules about how the financial sector, risk-taking, the extent to which they can take advantage, manipulate the market, insider trading. There are rules about globalization. So the real battle, the political battle over the last 40 years in the United States has been about those rules. With one side very aware that as they rewrote those rules, it created more opportunity for those at the top. And the rest of society not really realizing how important the rules were. They just looked the other way. But after this 40 years of this rewriting the rules, we now realize what it has meant. And we now have to rewrite the rules once again. These rules have large distributive consequence. Changing them can affect the market distribution of income. We sometimes call that pre-redistribution. And if you get rules that lead to more equality of income, you don't need to redistribute. The burden of redistribution is reduced. So let me just give you some example. I've talked about the rules that allow corporations more market power, that allows them to raise their price. That's like lowering your standard of living. Another set of rules are in the labor market. The opportunity for workers to get together for collective action have been very severely restricted in the United States and in some other European countries. There are rules about corporate governance, and I'll come to those in a second. The rules were written in an era of neoliberalism in ways that led to more inequality, more market power, a less efficient economy. They ignored the need for and importance of collective action. Markets can't address the problems of externalities or of massive exploitation. And they had a particularly narrow view of what a market economy was. Let me just give you one example of that. What is the objective of the firm has been a very controversial issue. And before the 1980s, 75, the view was that particularly in large public corporations, the obligation of the management and of the company was to serve society more broadly. And then Milton Friedman came in with this idea that the objective of the firm should be only to maximize shareholder value. Now, Milton Friedman was a good economist, but he was also an ideologue. And he had a very right-wing political agenda. The issue of whether shareholder value maximization would lead to economic efficiency and the well-being of society was a question that I thought, answered in a series of articles in the economics literature. He never bothered to refute those arguments. I argued that shareholder value maximization did not, in general, lead to societal well-being. He was not interested in replying to the analysis. He had a political agenda, and he pushed it forward. Well, in the light of what's happened in the United States in the last 10 years, where shareholder value maximization led to the financial crisis, the pharmaceutical companies led to the opioid crisis, the food companies leading to the childhood diabetes crises, the car companies leading to Dieselgate and the misrepresentation of the fuel emissions. All these, and I could go on, has led to a very severe criticism of the corporate sector if it just maximizes shareholder value. And the interesting thing happened about a month ago. About 95% of America's leading business people, the Business Roundtable, came out and said shareholder capitalism isn't working and that we should have stakeholder capitalism, that the companies should look at their workers, at the communities in which they operate, at their customers. They need to take a broader perspective. Now, many of us don't believe that they meant it, but, and I won't be personal about the particular people who said it, but the fact is, it is setting the scene for legislation. Legislation was passed, the rules in the 1980s, that said companies have to maximize their shareholder value and are not allowed to look at anything else. And now we're going to change the law to say you ought to have a broader perspective. Well, let me just skip through one other. One of the important aspects of rewriting the rules that I haven't had a chance to talk about involves the environment. Because without rules to protect the environment, obviously if you're maximizing shareholder value, why would you spend any money in not polluting? If it costs you money not to pollute, it's wasting money to spend to do that. And so the result of all this is that around the world, we have a pollution problem. Climate change has becoming a real sense of urgency, that we are well on the target to having 3 and 4 degree centigrade increase in temperature relative to before the industrial age. And we will not hit the Paris or Copenhagen goals at all. So we obviously are going to need rules and regulation to get people to stop polluting. And that is what the Green New Deal is about. It is about the whole change in our economic structure, including the rules of the game that we're going to need in order to achieve that. Well, let me just say a very few words about the other 3 elements of the progressive capitalist agenda. One of them is public expenditures, which includes public investments, public government assistance in the structural transformation. We're moving from in the United States, we're moving from a manufacturing economy to a service and innovation economy. We're having a demographic transition, and in India and in China and in other, the structural transformations are even more dramatic. And markets don't manage these transformations well on their own. And there's good theoretical reasons why you shouldn't expect them to. That is to say, why this is a real problem of market failure. They can't manage those difficult transformations. And we need government assistance, including systems of social protection, active labor market, and industrial policies. And finally, we need taxes and transfers to promote social equity. And that comes to the system of progressive taxation. Recent study that just came out about 2 weeks ago in the United States showed that the tax rate paid by the bottom 50% was higher than the tax rate paid by the top 0.1%. We have a regressive tax system. Warren Buffett said it was wrong for him to pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. But not all of America's wealthiest people are trying to get their tax rates, get a fair tax system. The remarkable thing about the 2017 Trump tax bill, he called it a tax decrease, but it wasn't. A majority of Americans in the second, third, and fourth quintiles, that's the vast majority, will face a tax increase in order to pay for a tax decrease for the corporations and those at the very top. So, you know, the United States, I described before the level of inequality, and rather than fight against that inequality, what did the Trump administration do? Decided to make it even more unequal. I described before the problems of lack of health in the United States, the declining life expectancy. And what did the Trump administration do in that same bill? Some 13 million more Americans will not have health insurance. And so life expectancy will go down even more. So the good news is within the progressive agenda, there is now widespread support in the United States for more progressivity, even across the board, because a lot of people are concerned with the fact that we have too large of a divided society, and unless we deal with it, things will get worse. And the final point I want to raise is that even if we passed all the things I've just described, our growth will get stronger, we will have more equality, but some aspects of what we call a decent life will still be difficult for many people. And we're talking about education for their children, housing, a decent retirement, and a whole set of what you call, they may not have access to employment opportunities. And so that leads to the necessity of having what I call a 21st century reinvigorated welfare state. And I can't go through all of them, but I might mention something that may be somewhat controversial here in India, but you have provided an inspiration for a lot of discussion in the United States. There is now discussion in the United States for a employment guarantee scheme. That what people in the United States are saying is, if India, a relatively poor country, can afford a rural employment guarantee scheme, can't the United States afford it? And one of the points the critics say, well, shouldn't we leave it to the market? Shouldn't we leave it to monetary and fiscal policy? And one of the answers is, well, if the market works, if a monetary and fiscal policy work, you don't need a rural employment guarantee scheme. We'll get full employment. But too often it has not worked. And it has not worked for some special groups in America. For African Americans, for many Hispanics, it has not worked. So the view, there's a growing view that maybe, this will inspire the market to work better. And if it inspires the market to work better so we don't need a employment guarantee scheme, all the better. But if it doesn't work, then why shouldn't the government step in? And the government programs in the New Deal under President Roosevelt worked very well. They actually left a legacy which we are benefiting a lot from today. The investments that were made, the public investments that were made, the art projects that were done, a whole gamut of public employment actually is part of our living legacy today. So I thought you might be interested in just that you've inspired a debate in the United States as it has gotten a debate here in India. So let me just conclude. A new course is needed. The old economic model has failed over a course of 4 decades. I call it, around the 1980, there was be thought of as an experiment, neoliberalism, a new set of ideas. In the United States, we call it a supply-side economics. It had different names in different countries. It was supposed to lead to higher economic growth, lower the tax rate, would incentivize, deregulate, would free up the economy. Those together would lead to higher economic growth from which everybody would benefit. Don't worry about tax revenues because the economy is going to grow so much that your deficits will be wiped out. Well, that experiment didn't work. And there was no excuse, by the way, for believing that in December 2017. You may know that the United States will have, this coming year, our first $1 trillion deficit. No one else will touch us for a long time in that sphere. And growth already is slowing. So the point is, if you do an experiment, a social experiment like this, and it didn't work for a year or two, you can say it's too soon to tell. There was a famous quip when Zhou Enlai was asked about what he thought about the French Revolution, and his reply, diplomatic reply, too soon to tell. The neoliberal experiment, 40 years, I think it is time enough we can say 40 years of failure. And not in one country, in country after country around the world. So that economic model has not worked. That doesn't mean that every aspect of that we can learn from the successes and the failure, but that overall economic model is a failure. And mild changes, a little bit more here, a little bit less there, are not likely to make matters much better. What we need is major changes based on what we have learned from successes and failures here and elsewhere. What you call it, whether you call it progressive capitalism or social democracy, is not important. What is important is what we do. And here, just to reiterate, we need, I believe, a new social contract, a new economic order based on a new relationship between the market, state, and civil society. And I think that new social contract can produce greater growth with more equality and address the climate and inequality crisis that we are confronting today. Thank you.
Take questions. So we'll have time for a few questions. Sachin, is there a mic here for Joe? And then we can take questions. Please try to keep your questions short and succinct so that we can get as many as possible, and Joe can answer. So, okay, there's one question I see there, 2, 3. Okay, we'll start 1, 2, 3, and then, yeah, go ahead.
In the year 1974, US President Richard Nixon adopted the fiat currency vis-a-vis the gold standard. Most of your graph and data pretty much signifies the 4 decades and so. In your opinion, do you think the adoption of the fiat currency, when creating money out of thin air, led to the inequality that we see, or the debt or the financial crisis?
No.
Okay. Good. You want to try?
Yeah. I don't think the problem is fiat currency. I do think that the way we have delegated power to the financial system to create credit without adequately either taxing or regulating has been a problem. Let me just give you one aspect of this that is particularly relevant for the last decade. Quantitative easing had a little effect in stimulating economy. It saved the banking system from collapse, so that was important. But it didn't. It stimulated the economy, but just a little bit. But what it did do, by lowering the interest rates a lot, meant that the value of equities went up. Who owns the equities, and who owns the debt? The equities, are owned disproportionately by the top 1%. Who owns the debt? It's people who are not so well off and don't want to take the risk of equity. So that change did lead to a significant increase in the inequality of wealth holdings. And so there are inequality consequences of the way monetary policy is conducted.
Okay, so there's a question. No follow-ups. I'm sorry. There's a question. Yeah, you have that, and then you. There's a person with the mic already. Yeah.
I have a very simple question. How would progressive capitalism tackle value attribution for natural resources which are assumed to be free around the world right now?
Natural resources are assumed to be free. How does progressive capitalism handle that?
Oh, well, that's part of the issue of what I call the Green New Deal, of how do we, and I call it living within our planetary boundaries. And the answer is, obviously, we have to price scarce natural resources. We treat water and air as if it were free, and when it's free, people waste it. But I also think you need to have regulations. I'm not an advocate of just pricing. I think you need regulations and you need public investments. For instance, in the area of carbon, one of the alternatives to using private automobiles is public transportation. And it solves some of the congestion problems that you probably know about here in Bangalore. And so that it's a more efficient use of time, and public transportation is not going to be solved just by pricing or regulation. So you need public investments, you need regulation. We shouldn't allow any coal-fired electric generation, period. And we also have to incentivize people to use our scarce natural resources efficiently.
Okay, there's a gentleman there with a black jacket. And then, yeah. No, just behind Sachin, the gentleman with the black jacket. Please.
So as you rightly pointed out, it's neoliberalism which really changed the world in many ways. And a lot of the ideologues like Friedman and Buchanan really molded, the 70s and from there on. But the economists also contributed a lot to that. Are the economists really working on rewriting the rules? Because recently I just looked at my, university where I study, and they're still talking about macroeconomics in Hilbert space. So I don't know whether they're really working today, like you are saying, on these issues.
So the answer is some economists. Arjun is working on the right side of these issues. To me, the biggest disappointment of the 2008 crisis was I had expected the macroeconomists to say mea culpa. And our models were wrong. We need to redefine them. But it's very hard when people have invested a lot of their intellectual energies in one direction to get them to change course. And I'll just tell a little story. I wrote an article a couple years ago about where macroeconomics went wrong. And I was quite specific what assumptions they had gotten wrong, and here was the right way to approach it. The standard macroeconomic models said that the 2008 crisis could not have occurred. There's some evidence that it did occur. And so you would have thought if you have a strong prediction like that, you would say something is wrong with my model. Not a word. So that group, Ben Bernanke, said there was nothing wrong with his model. A little problem in implementation, a little problem that cost a couple $1 trillion, but don't worry about that. That was a detail. So I wrote an article, and it got a little attention. And one of the things on social media, you can get a little bit of a graphic picture of reaction. All the younger economists, not all, but the under 35, loved the article. The over 60 loved the article. But that vast middle group who has spent their life constructing this misshapen view of macroeconomics hated it. And they hated it with a vehemence that showed that I had gotten underneath their skin, and that they clearly, I hit a nerve that they didn't like. I also should point out that there are many strands of economics that have actually tried to address some of the issues I talked about. Behavioral economics has really tried to recognize that we're not the kind of rational, fixed preference view that has dominated for several hundred years. Game theory has given us tools to analyze power and imperfect competition. Network theory has given us ways of understanding the complex interrelationships among the units of the economy, and explain how you could have one bank go down and bring down the whole economic system. So I don't want to, there have been a lot of advances, but I find it actually amazing how resilient this group of people have been to evidence.
So I know there were two questions here, but I'd like to take the question from the lady here, and then we'll come back to that side. This.
Professor Stiglitz, my question is, what is your view on RCTs, random control trials, for which, the Nobel, there's a big conversation about it in India. And do you think that it is an effective tool that directs policy that, reduces, that directs policy for poverty reduction?
Yeah. So actually, I've actually written about the subject. I'll give you the context in a minute. I think it's an important tool, but it is just one of several tools. So one has to see it within a broader array of tools to fight poverty and to promote economic well-being and economic growth. So there was an effort made a couple years ago to force a large fraction of the French aid budget to be subject to go through to be of that form. And the chief economist of the French aid agency was not very happy about that idea. And he thought it was mistaken. And he helped organize a large group of economists, including Angus Deaton, who I mentioned before, and me, to write a letter that was published in Le Monde and The Guardian, where what we pointed out are some of the limitations of RCT. So it's an important tool, but there are some limitations. Among the limitations, for instance, are that what is called external validity. Testing in one place, you don't know whether it'll be applicable to some other place. And it's very hard to know without testing it in those other places. And as you test it, the number of tests, the costs go up very high. So the presumption, it's true in medicine, but we have strong theories about people being sufficiently similar, and then we discover, well, African Americans may have different DNA that will react to certain medicines, but not others. So you have to be very, very specific about it. But in economics, the variety of responses to different societies can be very large. Experiments in economics have a long history that people forget. I mean, experiments in medicine have a very long history, but even in economics, experiments were done back in the 1970s, where we did a negative income tax. There was a negative income tax experiment that asked the question: how will people respond to getting a rebate from the government if their income gets below a certain level? And it was very interesting. It showed that the worries about labor effort were unfounded. that it did have other social consequences. Divorce rates went up because women with income could leave their husbands, and it gave you a view about what was going on that you might not have had. And it showed that people searched longer for a job and got better, more productive jobs. So the effort effect was not important, but there were some positive effects. So it can give you insights.
Okay.
But just one more example, as you know, one of the most important innovations in development has been microcredit. Eunice is, at the bottom has really given people raised standards of living. When Eunice began it, he was very clear that it was important that it be done by not-for-profits, not-for-profit institutions, and that it have social dimension. And BRAC, which was another thing besides Grameen Bank, was all about women's empowerment. It was about women's education, legal rights, health. So it was put in the context of credit as being one part of social change. When it came to India, they forgot all those lessons. And you had, or at least some of those lessons, and there was a big bankruptcy of microcredit, which was described as your subprime crisis. So the point I want to make is when they did RCTs on microcredit, they didn't test for what was the critical thing being not-for-profit. They had all kinds of detailed provisions about repayment periods and details, but the core of what made it work or not was never tested. And so they didn't give an insight into preventing the biggest failure. And overall, the fundamental thing is that they give you insights into small improvements that make things work better. And especially improvements that can be done, within the private sector or within a particular range of public interventions. They don't ask big questions like, what was the source of the East Asia miracle? Industrial policy. You can't do random controls on industrial policy. We'll find 20 countries, 100 countries, and we'll try industrial policy on half and non-industrial policy on the other half. And we'll keep the politics the same, and we'll keep everything else the same. You can't imagine that. But what has made the biggest difference in poverty alleviation around the world? It's been very successful growth strategies. And so it leaves out some of the really important elements of, all the things that I've talked about today. Most of those cannot be tested with RCT. So it's important, but one has to keep it in perspective.
Okay, the gentleman in the blue and then this gentleman in the pink, and then we'll come to you. Yes.
Professor Stiglitz, you make a very strong argument for reforming today's kind of broken capitalism into progressive capitalism. But what gives you faith that you won't go down a slippery slope into regressive socialism? Why would the throttles be set at exactly the point you call progressive? And why wouldn't the masses just want to build a dysfunctional state instead of the progressive state you're talking about?
Well, I think one of the things I keep emphasizing is the important role for democratic institutions, checks and balances, democratic dialogue, and good education. So, in a way, maybe I have a naive faith in democracy, and it's obviously being challenged in today's world. But the hope of things like the public discourse is that, and a free media, and is that we constantly ask the question, is this going to lead to a better functioning economy, society? And are we leading to new forms of rent seeking? And let me say, the basic thing is the democratic agenda, or what I call it, is never over. It's never going to be finished in the sense that there's constantly going to be scrutiny, and we're going to have to constantly check ourselves. And so I don't have any surefire guarantee, but what we've seen in a way is movements on the right, neoliberalism, is leading us, I think, into an era of demagogues and neo-fascists. So if I, what we're experiencing in the United States, if I would say, would I rather try another 10 years or 20 years of neoliberalism or try 20 years of progressive capitalism, for me, there's no contest. We tried one, and we're getting the results of that, and it's at least worth trying the other side.
So there's a question there, and then this young lady here.
Given the thrust of your arguments, I was wondering what your view is on the work of Karl Polanyi, particularly his argument that the subordination of society to markets leads to a market predicated fundamentally on fictitious commodities, and that drives a counter-movement of social protectionism.
Well, I think the basic spirit of what talked about was right, and he the title of his book was called The Great Transformation, and he was highlighting the difficulties of making a transformation at that point from a very agrarian economy into just to the nascent period of urbanization and industrialization, and the difficulty of that, and basically the market didn't handle that very well, and that just in a sense reiterates the point that I made, that we're not handling the current transformation, the transformation from in the United States from an industrial economy into innovation and a service sector economy. And the Polanyi was very, I think, sensitive to how that transformation changes the nature of society itself and the nature of the people. And that was one of the things that I tried to emphasize in the very beginning of my talk.
Okay, young lady here.
Hi, sir. I have two questions. The first one is, when you say not-for-profit institutions, organizations, do you refer to organizations that are part of the social sector only and are subsidized by the government or any external agency? Or are we looking at organizations that are okay with not aiming for a lot of profits and only enough to sustain themselves? That is one. And the second question is, why is there a general inclination in the media, by institutions, by countries, towards looking at current growth rates instead of real? As you showed, when adjusted for inflation, you get the real picture. So,
I didn't get the second question.
So, why do people care about nominal rather than real growth rates? Why do people care about nominal rather than real growth rates?
Real?
Inflation.
I think most people care about, in the long run, they care about real growth. They worry about their standards of living and not just wages. I mean, there's obviously in the short run some what economists call money illusion, but but it is real standards of living. On the first issue, I try to emphasize that we need a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. And by that I meant a whole variety of things. Let me just give you a couple. On the more productive side, I mentioned co-ops. But there's a new form of business organization called B corporations in the United States, who are saying we don't want to be constrained by the objective of maximizing shareholder value. So they've asked for, and several states have said, that you can get a corporate charter where you're not obligated to maximize shareholder value. That's going beyond the kind of changes that many people in the, like Elizabeth Warren have talked about, of change, and Bernie Sanders, they want to change the obligations facing all firms to have a broader view, which is consistent with, for instance, the way that German firms have, where they have stakeholder capitalism and where they get representation of workers. We have another form of organization in the United States called ESOPs, where employees run their organization or have a significant voting power control. So I think what I think we need is more experimentation with different organizational forms. Some may work well in some contexts and not in others. This goes back a little bit to the random control issue. It's hard to think about how you do RCTs in some of these institutional forms. But also in the social sector, there are lots of experiments going on with the role of for-profits, not-for-profits, and I think what we've learned in the United, and some of this may be very culture-specific, different countries. We've learned that in the United States, for-profit universities typically don't work very well. I mentioned Trump University. In other countries, there have been greater success in getting for-profit universities with appropriate regulation. One of the problems in the United States with the for-profit universities is they were owned by Wall Street, a lot of them, and they lobbied very strongly against any regulation. And the interesting aspect of rank seeking in that, and this is, they're saying, we believe in market. Their students all got student loans from the government. So you had Wall Street saying we believe in the market, creating for-profit universities, all the students of which were financed by the US government. And then they say, but we don't want any regulation. We were trying to get, this goes back 25 years, we were trying to get regulations that said the government should not give loans to students to enroll in universities where the students don't graduate or don't get jobs. Not a very complicated regulation. Just look at the history of the school. If the students don't get jobs so they can't pay back the loan, you don't get a student loan. These Wall Street firms, these for-profit universities said, no, that's interfering with the market. And the fact was they were exploiting the fact that a lot of the people graduating high school were not well informed. They didn't know that there were jobs or that these schools were working. We were even trying to get information out there, and these for-profit universities said, no, that's confusing people. Interesting thing was, we finally got some regulation for the graduates, for the veterans of the military. The idea that these for-profit universities would exploit veterans was outrageous. So we could get legislation there, but to exploit people who had not gone in the military, that was okay. Figure.
So I know that because of the way I'm standing, I'm only looking there. So one question here, and then I'll move to this side of the room. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Professor Stiglitz, kind of linked to some of the answers you've given to the previous ones. If I just stand back and look at history, petrol was good, today not good. Coal was good, today not good. Plastic was good, today not good. Some time back, egg yellow was not good, today irrelevant. Cholesterol was bad, today irrelevant. So capitalism was good, today not good. Communism was not good, not good. So there's a situation where new information is destroying whatever history has shown us, experience has shown us. Therefore, are we doomed to continuous future failures, or a continuous way of how do we kind of future-proof ourselves through all this? Otherwise, every 40 years, we'll be sitting through situations like this again and again.
Well, we can never be sure. I mean, that's life. You can never, everything I say could prove to be wrong, and but I think you have to view the economy as always evolving. Technology is always evolving. One of the critiques of macroeconomics, as it was that I said, is that it has a view of the world as if it's static, that nothing's changing, we're not learning. But the reality is we're constantly learning. And the world with, we didn't have complex finance 40 years ago. We have complex finance today. So we have to deal with it. We didn't have the technology companies 20 years ago that we have today. So why should we think that answers that may have worked in an agrarian economy would work today? So the market economy, as we had, might be actually quite good in a particular time. It might work in a particular context. But the context is constantly changing, and we have to be willing to adapt. And part of that adaptation is the recognition that some of what we believed before may not be quite right. And so we have to be willing to adapt our thinking and recognize that we'll be wrong. And so we always have to hold our beliefs with a certain degree of tentativeness and diffidence and willing to change course. And I think one of the faults of neoliberalism was that it held the views with excessive confidence. Economic theory was very clear that in advanced countries, globalization would lead to a reduction in wages of unskilled labor. That was very clear. So that without government assistance, some people were going to be bigger losers. And that's why a lot of us who thought we could have globalization said we have to accompany it by redistributive policies to protect them. Active labor market policies. Some countries like Sweden did it. But some group in the United States, there was this naive belief in trickle-down economics that somehow if the economy grew, everybody would be better off. There was no theory behind that. So neoliberalism had a set of ideas that had no basis in economic theory. And as a result of that, when it turned out that things weren't working right, they should have said, we needed to change course. but they were either too pig-headed or too self-interested. It was pushed by people who were the winners, and they didn't change course. So that seems to me the lesson that you want to get out of that, of those experiences that you described.
Okay, so I know there's many questions. I'm really sorry. I'll focus on this side. The person in the blue there, maybe we'll have time for maybe 3 questions. So the person in the blue, the lady in the yellow. And,
You talked about changing the rules of the game. And for example, the corporation taxes pay a lesser rate of taxes than an individual, and the capital gains tax is lower than earned income. But given that politicians are the ones writing the rules, and they also write the rules of how they get elected, what is your solution? Because both the major parties in the United States don't seem to want to change the system at all. They think the system is fine, and it just needs a little tweaking, and not any drastic major change.
Well, I think this is where there is a major change going on in the Democratic Party in the United States. I think a majority, it's hard to, but I think a majority, and perhaps a vast majority, of those in the Democratic Party now believe that there needs to be a major change. One of the reasons, and you're absolutely right, it's not only the economic rules, it's the political rules. And it's the political rules which include the voter suppression, the gerrymandering. Let me just give you one example of what has led to a real anger about the politics in the United States. Gerrymandering, you know, is where you draw the districts in such a way that even though you get, say, 45% of the votes in the state, you get 80% of the representatives, okay? So you get you draw the districts in such a way that you, even though you have a minority of the votes, you get a majority of the control. And you see that in the U.S. Congress. Just to get in the last election, about, I think, 60% of the votes went to Democratic candidates in the Senate, and the Republicans increased the representation in the Senate. Until 2018, a vast majority of votes went to Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives, but the House of Representatives was controlled by the Republicans. So the disconnect between the voting and the outcome. So this went to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court said, this is not a matter for the court to rule on. The political process should correct it. The Supreme Court didn't answer the question, if you have a gerrymandered political process, how can a gerrymandered political process correct gerrymandering? They didn't answer that. And so there's a real disillusionment with our whole political system right now. And and then with money in politics, the last election, each of the candidates spent over $1 billion. And when I say spent, the contributions were not donations, they were investments that they expect a return. And the investments made by the financial community got a very high return. So there is a realization that something is broken in our political system, even more than our economic system. And we have to fix that to get the reforms in the economic system. And I think if a Democrat gets elected, I think it's one of the things that you can expect to see very high on the agenda.
Okay, so the lady in the yellow, and then one last question after that. Yes. Okay, the lady at the back.
Professor
Okay.
Stiglitz. I had a question around what do you actually see as the actual transition happening from the individualistic to the collective? What are some of the triggers, or how we could leverage that? Because it seems to me that seems to be the crux of the problem. Even if you wanted, a different politics in economics, you want people to be acting differently. So where are we looking towards in terms of our own transition from the individual to the collective?
I think climate change has been pivotal, especially among the young people, because they realize that the markets on their own won't solve the climate change problem. They see their future put in jeopardy, and they really feel it very intensely. So for them, the only answer to climate change is some form of collective action. So that's been the you might say, the most important source of the change in mindset. There are a couple of others, though. The young people, or everybody, now feels in the United States the weight of market power. You have no choice in the airlines, in the internet, in your telephone, your cable TV. They feel power around them. And they can't do anything against that power. And so their view is only acting collectively can we get a check on that power. So that's been a second very strong force. And then related to that, they're seeing a whole set of, you might say, weakening of their rights as citizens. I mean, let me give you. If you have a dispute with a corporation in the United States, it has to go to arbitration. And the arbitration is run by arbitrators that are basically appointed by the businesses. So you go to a kangaroo court and you lose. And people are experiencing this over and over and over again. And there's sort of, one of the important parts of collective action is collective dispute resolution, a collective judiciary. And they're realizing, we don't have that anymore. And so these are just little pieces by piece. The public space is being reduced, and they're beginning to feel how it is affecting their lives and their sense of the fairness of our society. So it's deep enough now, I think, that there will be some actions.
Okay, the last question back there, and then we'll have to close. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. It was an amazing talk, and it reminded me a little bit of the book of Raghuram Rajan, The Third Pillar, where he talks about how markets have failed us as a community and a society, and how markets are no longer just based on merit, but more on where you come from, so which family you belong to and what do you have as a starting point. So I wanted to ask, because I'm from a university, and I wanted to bring back the talk to what universities can do, and if you could talk a little bit about what the Institute of New Economic Thinking and Rethinking Economics of Hajun Chang and initiatives like these can do for changing the curriculum, changing the narrative of what economics should be. Thank you.
I think you're supposed to come up here. Don't know. That's not good.
Oh, it's gone. It's back again. Yeah. So there are some very exciting initiatives trying to address some of the problems that I've described. And just let me mention two that Arjun is involved in both of these. One of them is the Institute of New Economic Thinking, which was founded in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008. And fortunately, some philanthropists were persuaded that the old economic models clearly weren't working, and that the economics profession had gotten itself into a rut and needed to be pushed a little bit. As I said, there were many strands of vibrant research in behavioral economics, game theory, but there were many strands that were not working so well. And the hope was that by giving more attention, particularly to young people thinking in alternative ways. It would help create a new generation that was thinking differently and focusing on more of societal problems, including climate change. I mean, one of the things that's really striking, if you look at the major economic journals, the fraction of articles about climate change is very small. The fraction of articles about inequality is very small. So you wouldn't know that we were facing all these crises if you looked at the standard journals. And so this was trying to create a community of people working on these different ways. And interestingly, it's been particularly successful in developing countries and among young people. And there's something called the Young Scholar Initiative that I gave a talk, for instance, in Mexico. I think there were a couple thousand young people that showed up for it. And you know, so there is a resonance among young people for different models that address some of these concerns more forcefully. But obviously, views about the economy become very ingrained in teaching in high school, teaching in college, that gets reflected in the media. Not a surprise, you know, the media, who are they going to call up if they want a view? They're going to call up somebody in the financial community or the business community, and they're going to represent those ideas. So you get a set of views that become common in the public domain that represent a particular perspective on economics. And that's why it's very important to rethink the economics curriculum. And there's a project called CORE. I don't
know what it stands for.
I don't know what it stands for, but it
Curricular
is,
online resources in economics.
Yeah, it is an online project, global in its nature, of trying to rewrite the curriculum. And at the same time, because it's online, take away some of the rents that the publishers get from their monopoly control of the publishing. In the United States, the economics textbooks now cost almost $300. And you could, if you have one of those leading textbooks, it's very good business. If you're a publisher of those leading, but this intends to subvert them by having an online business model, but more importantly, actually present an alternative view of economics, which includes an emphasis on this issue of how do we cooperate together? How do we, the importance of markets not working, the lack of competition, focusing on a lot of the kinds of issues that the presence of inequality, innovation, a lot of the issues that I've tried to talk about today, which for the most part are not represented in the standard economics course, which are, remarkably similar to what Adam Smith would have taught 200 and some years ago.
Okay, I would be remiss to not mention the fact that actually Azim Premji University also contributed quite extensively to the development of CORE. I know there are a lot of questions, and I've also unfortunately had to ignore many people who've had their hands up, but we're well over time. So please join me in thanking Professor Stiglitz for a very stimulating talk. And thank you all for coming.